and Happy New Year to everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome my friend Frank Morgan, who's really quite a new member of the Circle of Wine Writers, but he's absolutely not a new communicator to wine. He's been communicating on wine for over 12 years. He lives in Chesapeake near Virginia Beach. He's got a mysterious sort of legal day job in the aeronautical industry, and it has this sort of one big advantage that in normal times it allows him to travel regularly to Europe. And so Brett and I first actually met Frank 10 years ago in the autumn of 2011 at the Brescia European Wine Bloggers Conference. And Frank's blog, which is called beautifully Drink What You Like, was already well established at that point, a couple of years old. Since then, I've had the pleasure of meeting Frank regularly in Europe, and I've always been impressed by the fact that all his leisure time away from his family somehow seems to be devoted to learning about wine and to hanging out with other wine people around the world. The most memorable time that we met up was in 2019 when he took me in hand and helped me organize a little trip in Virginia, mainly to promote my book. But of course, he took me for a day out in the vineyards, in the Virginia vineyards, where it became really obvious to me how much Frank is admired and respected by the winemakers over there. It was mentioned earlier, not all of you were sort of in the room, but the Circle has had a long attachment to Virginia, largely thanks to the importer and unofficial Virginia ambassador, Chris Parker, who helped set up 2 trips for the Circle, the first in 2010, the second in 2014, neither of which I made it to. There was also a memorable Christmas party in London and a really comprehensive tasting beforehand in 2011. So we really do need an update, and who better than Frank, who not only writes regularly on his blog about Virginia, but was also running online chats with winemakers way back in 2013, called Virginia Wine Chat, and very much revived those for the early days of the pandemic, which I think people found very useful and comforting for the winemakers. In addition, Frank writes for several local news outlets in Virginia and nearby DC, including, among many others, the Virginia Pilot magazine, newspaper, Wine and Country Life magazine, Piedmont Virginian magazine, and Edible DC magazine. So thank you, Frank, for giving some of your valuable time to us, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Wink, for that introduction. I thank all of you for taking time out of your morning or your afternoon to be with us, to listen to me talk about something that I feel passionate about, which is the wines, winemakers, wineries, and geology of Virginia. So thank you very much. And for all of you that will watch this recording after the fact, very much appreciate your time as well. And Wink, it's been, an honor to be your friend. And of course, when you came to Virginia, that was a fun trip just to take you around and meet the winemakers and all of that stuff. And I hope that for those of you who have not been here, I hope that you will consider a trip to the Commonwealth, because, Virginia has a lot of stories to share and a lot of fantastic wine. When I was first emailing Liz about this presentation about, I'd like to talk about Virginia wine, I intended initially to say, okay, I'm going to present on where Virginia wine is today and then going forward. And after trading emails with a friend who was not able to be here on this webinar, she suggested maybe take a step back and talk about history just for some context. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, especially one of the most notable individuals. I won't spend as much time on him, but the far left of the House of Burgesses, that's allegedly where, wine in Virginia got its start. Act 12 of 1619 was passed by the House of Burgesses, and that required all male households to plant and tend 10 grapevines, European vinifera grapevines. Of course, there was too many other challenges beyond just the climate. That never worked out. The gentleman to the right is Thomas Jefferson. He is rarely missed when there is an article or a session about Virginia wine. So I'm going to pass over him. I think oftentimes, in my opinion, he's given too much credit for doing too little. He did make several attempts, 4 attempts at growing grapes at Monticello, and then in a property adjacent to Monticello. Of course, Monticello is when Wink visited us in 2019, we toured the grounds of Monticello, and there where some of the old grapevines were planted, and where they've new grapevines have been cultivated by Gabriele Rousey. So, Jefferson, if you'd like to learn more about him, he had some fascinating characteristics about him. There's a book called Jefferson on Wine by John Hellman. Interesting read, and a chronicling of his wine time and exploits. The gentleman to his right is a contemporary of Jefferson called Charles Carter. And I put him in this slide because he is the first individual who is credited actually with making wine in Virginia. He was a governor of a colony, and in 1759, the Committee of Virginia Assembly was formed and charged with the question of economic diversification. And that was, of course, made even more urgent by, at the time of Depression and the tobacco trade, which happened again. And I'll talk a little bit about it at the very end. But moving forward, he planted grapes at his property at Cleve Plantation in King George, and sent a dozen bottles to London to be evaluated. And in 1763, at the time, the governor, Francis Fauquier, who was the governor of the colony of Virginia, had certified that the Carter family was successfully growing European vines, and it was a whole decree. And this was the first recorded history of successful grape production here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. To the right is the Monticello Wine Company. That's a sign that Paul, I don't know if you ever saw that in Charlottesville, but this is a road marker where the Monticello Wine Company was based in the late 1800s, and it was started by a German called Oscar Ryerson, who he founded it, and it was a co-op, and they grew Delaware, Catawba, Norton, and those sorts of grapes, and actually produced wine, but unfortunately shut down. They did win an award at the 1876 Vienna Exposition for their extra Virginia claret. So they are on record of having won an award. That brand actually was reconstituted in 2014 by a local family who owns another winery. So now there is the Monticello Wine Company wines that are available. The Smith family owns it. They also own Afton Mountain Vineyards. But very interesting story in the Monticello Wine Company as well. And finally, the gentleman to the right doesn't get a lot of ink in the wine world, although I have an article coming out about him. That is John June Lewis Sr. He was born in 1894, and he actually cultivated a love of viticulture and winemaking while he was serving in the American Army of Occupation in the Rhine Valley of Germany during the First World War. And so after the war, he returned to Virginia, to the Mecklenburg County area, and he worked in the lumber industry until 1933, until the repeal of Prohibition. And soon after, he planted 10 acres of grapevines. That's a huge planting, here in Virginia, especially back then. And in 1940, he opened Woburn Winery, and it is said to be America's first African-American owned winery. And that was in 1940. And he actually made wine there at Woburn Winery until his death in 1974. So he doesn't get a lot of recognition, but he did play a role. He made, of course, Lambrusco and hybrid grapes over the course of that 3 decades, but he did play a role in the early years of Virginia wine. He actually was just maybe a couple of decades ahead of his time, because the Virginia wine industry really started in 1976. Beyond all of these neat historical facts, it really did start in 1976, and that was when the gentleman to the far left, 6th generation Italian wine scion, Yanni Zonin, came to Virginia. He purchased an 870-acre antebellum property in the beautiful rolling hills of the town of Barboursville, where Paula mentioned she lived. this is a very historic property. It's a very beautiful property with these wonderful rolling hills and meadows. And there it was the former home of one of Virginia's 17th governor, James Barber. He was a contemporary of Mr. Jefferson and lived in a home there on the property. Unfortunately, that home burned down on Christmas Day of 1884, so some years after his death. But the ruins of that home still stand on the Barboursville property. And that really is the historic centerpiece of the property. Very beautiful, but it is, the ruins are still there and you can visit them. And beside it is also another structure that now serves as a small inn. But when Zonin came to Virginia, he had a lot of options of where to establish his U.S. operation, California, Oregon, places like that. But for Virginia, in his mind, presented a unique opportunity to help, found and build a wine industry, which they've done. That antebellum 870-acre beautiful property would become home to Barboursville Vineyards, which today is one of the largest winery operations in Virginia. It is one of the most notable for sure. And when he founded the Barboursville winery operation, locals thought they were mad because tobacco and other crops were the norm in growing grapes. I think Barboursville was officially the 5th winery in the entire state. But he called on one of his childhood friends, the gentleman there in the middle, Gabriele Rousey. He called on Gabriele to come and help him establish the vineyard, and that he did. Gabriele soon moved on to other projects. Since that time, Gabriele has established many of the most notable vineyards in Virginia. He has his own label that he works with his 2 sons. And he's also the director of gardens and grounds at Monticello, Jefferson's home. So I mentioned at the beginning, Jefferson's fingerprints are throughout the area, but Gabriele really is rightfully considered the father by many, the father of the Virginia wine industry, because he did so much in the early days to help establish vineyards and wineries. And he put a lot of sweat equity into flattening the learning curve for other people. Now, in 1990, Zonin called on Luca Peschina, who is another native Italian. He's from Alba. And he brought Peschina over to be the general manager and winemaker at Barboursville. And Luca is still the winemaker today at Barboursville, general manager. One of the most gracious, very much like Gabriele, one of the most gracious and humble people you'll meet, an exceptional winemaker. And he has helped really raise the bar of quality on Virginia wine and their Octagon wine that you can see a bottle shot there. That's why Barboursville is one of the most recognized names in the Virginia wine industry because of Luca and all the work that he has done when he got here and his expertise. So that is, kind of the beginning of Virginia wine, the history of it, how, some of the interesting points of the history dating back to 1619, and then really the beginning of the modern day Virginia wine industry began in 1976 with Barboursville. And the industry has grown considerably since then. Today, there's about 312 wineries, farm wineries here in Virginia. And I put about because I do know of a couple of that wineries that are technically closed now, but they still own the farm winery license. And I also know of a couple of brand new operations that have not opened, but they also have a winery license. So it's roughly 312 wineries, about 4,200 acres of vineyards. The Virginia Wine Marketing Office is still collecting the data from this prior year, but I traded emails with the director of that office, Annette Boyd, and she gave me the number roughly 4,200 acres. There are, for just having 4,200 acres, and I know that there's some places in California where that's that's one vineyard. So 4,200 acres is not a lot. In Virginia, there are 75 grape varieties that are cultivated for wine. That's a lot of grape varieties for 4,200 acres. So, Virginia, one of the takeaways is that there is a spirit of continual experimentation. Virginia's been blessed to attract a lot of tinkerers, viticultural tinkerers, and curious people. So 75 grape varieties, and I'll talk about some of those as we as we go through the presentation. There are 10 regions, 8 AVAs. Virginia is the 8th largest state for wine production, the 6th or 7th largest for the number of wineries. I put 6th or 7th because there is some discrepancy here, and I've counted it a number of different ways, but because I know the 312 winery number is a little squishy, there is a small margin of error, so it's the 6th or 7th largest for the number of wineries. But still, that's, Virginia's come a long way in 4 decades. And now the economic impact of just wine in Virginia is $1.37 billion. And that was determined by an economic study that was commissioned by the Virginia Wine Board. So the Virginia wine industry in 4 decades has come a long, long way. We are considered to have a mild, humid, subtropical climate. And I smile because if you've ever been here in the months of June, July, August, or September, you know that it is sweltering, especially in July. In August, it is intense humidity, lots of heat, bugs, every type of bug that you can imagine resides here. And every pest that could be bad for a grapevine seems to love the Virginia mild, humid, subtropical climate, but it is intensely hot in the summer. So this is a great place to come for a outdoor sauna. About 95% of all wine produced in Virginia is sold in the state. And that's both, in my opinion, an opportunity, but also a challenge that I'll talk about in a subsequent slide. Now, I present these just to give some context of how it started, how it's going. As I mentioned, hey, in 4 decades, this industry has really grown. And of course, there are other industries or other regions throughout the world that have experienced similar growth, but Virginia has, for its size, experienced enormous growth. And you can see in 1980, there were only 8 wineries. As I mentioned, in 1976, when Barboursville founded it, they were the 5th winery, and there were some other ones that were starting. Winery actually may be a loose term because some of the wines I'm assuming were challenging in the early days because they were planting all types of things, just trying to figure out, what will grow here. Riesling was planted on flat ground, Pinot Noir, and, grapes like that, that never had a chance of surviving. But in 1987, there were 40 wineries, about 1,200 acres. 1990, you can see the progression here. There was a lull between 90 and 2000, but starting in 2000, the industry really began to take off. There was a lot of learned experience shared by some of the Virginia wine pioneers, like Jim Law, Gabriella Rousey, Lucy Morton, who's a famed ampelographer who lives in the Charlottesville area. And so in 2000, that's really where they achieved some serious economies of scale in terms of knowledge sharing. They were attracting a lot of young new talent to the industry. So in the decade between 2000 and 2010, there was a lot of growth. You can see the industry went from 59 wineries to 190, up from 2,100 acres to 3,000 acres. So that's really significant growth. Considering how much it costs to plant, buy a vineyard, to start a vineyard, a winery operation, and to plant vineyards. The fixed cost around that time was probably $18,000 to $20,000. Today, it's roughly the fixed cost per acre is $25,000. I don't know how that stacks up to other regions, but that, in my mind, is pretty expensive. I looked at a couple of vineyard properties, when I had this brilliant idea that I wanted to start a small vineyard, hobby vineyard and orchard. And I looked at a couple of properties, and that was a real deterrent. Was a fixed price of the, actually getting a vineyard started to cultivate vines. And thankfully, I was talked out of buying one property that had 4 acres of grapes on it. But so today, like I said, there's roughly 312 wineries. Acreage is roughly 4,200 acres, and there's a lot of acreage that is coming online. And Virginia is largely made up of very small vineyards, family-owned vineyards, and now we're seeing much larger vineyard blocks of 20 and 30 acres at a time. So that's very promising for the future of Virginia wine. But really, it does come down to the dirt, to the geology. I find Virginia super fascinating from a geological perspective. And, I don't know if that's because it really is really cool or I just don't get out enough, but, Virginia is a very diverse state geologically and geographically. So the state spans roughly 430 miles from east to west, from Virginia's eastern shore west onto Tennessee and points west. It's about 200 miles from north to south, as you can see there. About 65% of our state is covered in forests. So that's like pine, hickory, oak are the predominant woods here. But we have 5 distinct, geological provinces. And I took that term from Bubba Beasley, who is a dirt guru. He's a soil scientist, very well known, does a lot of digging throughout the state, digs a lot of pits and vineyards to learn more about the dirt there and the geology. But if I may just start in the far right, because this is, if you've been to Virginia, then you probably were in Charlottesville. It's very red clay, because there's a lot of clay and iron in the soil. But on the coastal plain, this is where I live. In fact, I live kind of in the bottom right. We live on a lake that feeds into the Elizabeth River, that feeds into the Chesapeake Bay, but that's called the coastal plain, and that is largely flat, but it does rise to up to 300 feet in elevation. The Virginia Beach, Chesapeake areas here, Williamsburg, those sorts of areas. You can see that they look like fingers. Those are tidal rivers, the Potomac, Rappahannock, York River, and James Rivers. Very important, water sources to our area. They of course feed into the Chesapeake Bay. And here we have a lot of sedimentary and igneous rock based, lots of sandy loam on the eastern shore. We have one winery in the Eastern Shore AVA. It's all sandy loam, and it's very distinctive wines there, in my opinion. The wines grown in those regions tend to have a salty component. But if we move left to the Piedmont, that's where you'll find a lot of the wineries in the Charlottesville area and the Southern Virginia area. And here you can see this is where the rivers fall off, and there's very thick soils here, lots of iron in some of the soils, but bedrock underneath, where you have some Proterozoic, igneous and metamorphic rock there. If you dig down, if you look into a dig pit, it is really fascinating, all of the different soils and rocks there. And it's almost worth coming here just to, learn about the rocks. And, just last month, Wink and I had the occasion to visit a couple of properties in Chablis. And to me, it was equally fascinating walking through some of these vineyards and grabbing a handful of soil and finding oyster shells. And we were hundreds of kilometers from an ocean where there would be oysters. So that was, 150 million years ago. And I always find that really fascinating. It tells an interesting story about the region and about the wines. But if we move further west to the left, that's the Blue Ridge. There are, of course, wineries there. That peaks at roughly 4,000 feet in elevation, although the very, very highest peak is Mount Rogers at it's 5,238 feet in elevation. But there you'll find lots and lots of granite rocks. There are a couple of interesting wineries there along the southern Blue Ridge, like Nkita Ridge. But if we move further west, is the Shenandoah Valley, which is one of the most interesting areas of Virginia, and where a lot of winemakers, as the state begins to experience more of the impacts of climate change, a number of winemakers are setting up vineyards in the Shenandoah Valley because of the climate. It's a little bit cooler. They're often shielded from some of the rain that is very typical and common later in the growing season, and especially at harvest time. Hurricanes, Virginia is very hurricane prone, unfortunately. 2011, I think it was Hurricane Isabel. I think that was it. Came ashore on August 25th, and it rained in some parts of Virginia every day for 32 days. And that was in 2011. So Virginia, that's one of the challenges, one of the vintage challenges of Virginia, is that harvest time, heavy harvest time rains are common. And so some say that there are sites within the Shenandoah Valley that are shielded because of the mountains from some of those rainstorms. And there they have a lot of Frederick and Lodi silt with lots of limestone. So if you're in the Shenandoah Valley, you pick up lots and lots of limestones. And of course, further west is the Appalachian Plateau, and it gets very, very hilly there. But that is, the geological provinces of Virginia. That's just how Mother Nature set out the boundaries of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And of course, we set out the American viticultural areas. Me personally, so right now Virginia has 8. They just late last year were designated their 8th one, which is here in the green. Do the AVAs make a huge difference? In my opinion, it could, especially in some of the more established regions like the Monticello. I don't know, though, to consumers. Some years ago, I did a very informal Google survey where it was a Google form, and I invited lots of consumers through an email newsletter to fill out this survey. And one of the questions was, do you purchase wine based on the AVA? And the majority said no. I think it was like 68 or 69% said no. But I also asked, what is the most notable AVA in Virginia? And the Monticello AVA was it. You can see that circle in the middle. There are 42 wineries in the Monticello AVA. That's where Barboursville is, and other notable wineries like King Family Vineyards, Afton Mountain Vineyards, Keswick. So if you've been to Virginia, you know those names. Horton Vineyards, that's where Dennis Horton, who is one of the original Virginia wine pioneers, he started in 1983. And many of the grapes that this state has today can be directly attributed to Dennis Horton, because he was very curious person. He was a vinous tinkerer. He loved to plant and experiment with grapes, anything from Pinot Noir to Syrah to Mourvedre to Malbec. He just planted Viognier, Petit Verdot. He planted so many different grape varieties, and it was there in the Monticello region. In these 8 AVAs, I'll talk about just one out to the far east, to the far right. That's the Eastern Shore AVA. That where that number is that number 3 is where Chatham Vineyards is. And this is a vineyard that is at 0 feet elevation. They are right on a creek called Church Creek that feeds into a larger creek called Nassawadox that feeds right into the Chesapeake Bay. So they're essentially they share the vines, share a watershed with Nassawadox Creek and the Chesapeake Bay. And their wines, if you are interested in very distinctive wines of Virginia, please seek out Chatham Vineyards. Their Chardonnay, they're still Chardonnay, in my opinion, is one of the most site-expressive Chardonnays. It's very salty, very oyster shell, a lot of oyster shell notes to the extent there can be. Interesting, very compelling wines, because it's all sandy loam soils there that the roots are digging down and sharing the water with Church Creek. We always say there's the term miroir terroir. Oysters are grown just hundreds of yards from where the vines are growing, and it makes a compelling pairing. But going south of there, the green, that's Hampton Roads. That's our area. I call it coastal Virginia, but it is called Hampton Roads Tidewater. And recently, last fall, the Virginia Peninsula AVA was established. It includes 5 wineries right now. AVAs, we'll see how much of a difference that makes, but it was led by Patrick Duffler, who is another Virginia wine pioneer. He established Williamsburg Winery back in the early 1980s. So he, like many of the wine pioneers like Dennis Horton and Jim Law, Lucy Morton, they gave a lot of sweat equity to, plowing ground and flattening the learning curve for the next generation of winemaker. And up north, you can see Loudoun County. That's not an AVA. There's a Middleburg AVA that snakes through parts of that, but Loudoun County is a concentration of about 40 wineries and tasting rooms. That is less than an hour west of Washington, D.C. So they get a lot of traffic. Enotourism is very, very big and very, very important to Virginia. I mentioned in a previous slide that 95% of all of the wines, it's between 90 and 95%. Hard to get an exact number. Between 90 and 95% of all the wines made in Virginia are sold in Virginia, and that is both an opportunity and a challenge to the state. And of course, going further east or west, we have a couple of AVAs, but the most important ones are Monticello and the Shenandoah Valley, because that's where a number of winemakers are now setting up vineyards, because it's a cooler climate, shielded from some of the harvest season rains. And we'll see. I am very bullish on, very optimistic about the wines of the Shenandoah Valley. I think it, going forward, it's going to be one of the regions that we really see a lot of recognition come from, because the wines up on some of those very steep, rocky granite slopes are producing really compelling wines. I did see a comment in the chat, but I don't know if we want to take that now. Wink, I'll defer to you as the MC. You can interrupt me, or I'll keep going. I do want to keep it,
Yeah, I think, Frank, I think it was just about the winery you mentioned, the Eastern Shore. I think that's what it referred to, as to whether those vines were unrooted, which, you could answer now before we forget the Eastern Shore.
Oh yeah, hey, thank you for that, Wink. For some reason, I'm not able to click on the chat, but thank you for raising that. So I believe they are. John Winter, he is a second generation wine grower, and I believe those are own rooted. The wines I wish that all of you could try, especially their still Chardonnay, because it is a very distinctive wine. There is a interesting, a compelling salty note that runs through it. But yeah, it is, Wink. And so, Wink, by the way, if I have any other questions, please just interrupt me. I wanted to keep this as, to the extent that we could, interactive. I know I just kind of started going, and I should have apologized ahead of time and said, hey, if there are any PowerPoint enthusiasts or purists here, I apologize for these slides. PowerPoint is not my strength. So I just kind of put these together and said, okay, well, there's a lot to talk about Virginia, and there's a lot to try to talk about in 45 minutes. But so if there are other questions, please jump in and interrupt, or we can do the Q&A.
I do have one, Frank. In fact, that last one was from Neil, but I have one which I'm hoping you're about to talk about. At the beginning, you said there were 75 different grape varieties. So I'm not expecting you to name the 75, but are those all Vitis vinifera?
No, they're not. So that's in fact, my next slide will talk about some of them, but that includes vinifera. So most of the vines, roughly, when I did the math from the last commercial grape report, it worked out to be 87% of the grape vines, the land under vine here in Virginia was vinifera. The rest is a split between hybrids or multi-species, and then the native grape Norton, which I'll certainly talk about. But here you can see Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc are the two most planted grape varieties. There is a little more red wine in Virginia made than there is white, but it is reasonably close. I put an asterisk beside both Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc because, in Frank's opinion, and I judge the Virginia Governor's Cup every year. I judge the final round, so I taste 120 wines over the course of 3 days, and I organize 2 wine competitions: the Monticello regional wine competition, and then the Shenandoah Valley wine competition. And although as an organizer, I don't judge and score the wines, I do taste them all over the course of 2 days. And in my opinion, of tasting hundreds of local wines a year, Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc are the most site expressive. They, to me, tell the most story about their vineyards. They are my favorite wines made here in Virginia, like Linden's Hardscrabble Chardonnay, Chatham's Steel Chardonnay, King Family Chardonnay. I really love those. And Cabernet Franc, I could name so many of them, from Barboursville and even from Chatham on the Eastern Shore. Joy Ting, who I'm going to talk about in a subsequent slide. So Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc, I know that in some circles that's not a very sexy grape, but I love Chardonnay. I think the future, in my opinion, is Chardonnay. I just I don't know if anyone shares that. I love Chardonnay. I love drinking it from all over the world, but especially here. So anyways, Merlot being the third, and I highlight Petit Verdot because in brackets is 102 acres. Right now in Virginia, this is the most planted grape, the most planted new grape. And that tells you a lot, that a lot of winemakers and a lot of wineries are going all in on the Petit Verdot and Petit Manseng. So right now in Virginia, there are 102 acres of unbearing Petit Verdot. So they've been planted in the last year or two. That's very telling about where Virginia is going. And obviously with Petit Verdot and Petit Manseng, they, to the extent a grape is suited for Virginia, I'm not so sure there is a grape suited for this climate perfectly, but to the extent there is one, both of these grapes are thick skinned, small berried, looser clusters. Petit Manseng, I think, is a looser cluster than Petit Verdot, but winemakers and grape growers are really going all in on Petit Verdot and Petit Manseng. I will talk about our, Viognier. I kind of laugh, in 2011, the Virginia Wine Board designated Viognier as the state's official signature grape for marketing purposes. 2011 was a super wet year. Viognier is very fickle in the vineyards, especially here in Virginia, where there's intense humidity pressure, mildew pressures, pest pressures. Viognier, that was a premature designation, and of course that now has been overcome by events. It is no longer the state's signature grape. I'm hoping Virginia will hold off a decade or two before they designate or think about designating any grapes, because this industry is way too young to designate a grape or try to pigeonhole the entire state. Now, I think there's some virtue in designating a signature grape for a region to build a story around, but Viognier, it's 205 acres. There's not a lot of winemakers or grape growers planting Viognier. There is some, of course, there are some non-bearing acres, but most of the new acreage is being designated or devoted to Petit Verdot and Petit Manseng. Petit Manseng is a grape, as many of you know, or all of you know. It really is its origins are in the Jurançon region, but it has found a home in vineyards across Virginia. It is absolutely thriving here. It is so versatile. I mean, the small berries, thick skins, loose clusters, airflow can get in there and help reduce the mildew and the humidity pressures, or pressures from humidity. And winemakers are doing all types of really cool things with these, from the sweet dessert sticky wines like you would find in the Jurançon to bone dry. And their Petit Manseng it's a very high acid grape, lots of acidity, and so there is a delicate balance that you have to find with regard to balancing the sugars and the acidity, because you can have quickly a very high acid 16% alcohol wine. So right now, some of my favorites are Michael Shaps, who is a winemaker who's been making wine here for a few decades. He has a large operation called Michael Shaps Wineworks in Charlottesville, but he also has an operation in Burgundy and Meursault where he makes his Maison Shaps wines. Wink, I think you've had some of his wines before. And here in Virginia, he is one of the most recognized wine growers, makes some of the state's best wines. He does a lot of wine consulting and makes wine for wineries. And a lot of his wines have won, a lot of serious awards in our state level competitions and regional level competitions, but even beyond. So Michael Shaps has an exceptional Petit Manseng. Just a few years ago, Horton Vineyards, they made a Petit Manseng that won our Virginia Governor's Cup. Throughout the state, Dr. Joy Ting is making a Petit Manseng. So if you are looking for an interesting signature of Virginia wine, please consider tasting Petit Manseng. If you can't get some, please send me an email and I'll try to facilitate that. But these are really compelling wines. And I think I'm not a fan right now of designating one grape for Virginia, but this is a grape, given the versatility, it's being used for dry, off dry. The off dry, in my opinion, my favorites are the best. sweet, but it adds to white blends, especially to Viognier, which tends to be kind of flabby. It brings some beautiful lift and nice acidity to Viognier and other white blends that we are just scratching the surface. And right now there's 23 bearing acres. So about 33% of the total acreage is non-bearing, and I know winemakers are planting more of this grape because it is so interesting and compelling. So Wink, I know there's a couple of should I take a couple of questions?
Well, there was one we're going to leave to the end, but just Meg had a question just now about reds, and whether most of them are single varietal or whether there are blends as well.
Good question. Thank you, Meg, for that. I should have covered that. The most notable wines right now really are the red Bordeaux style blends. Cab Franc, Merlot, Cab Sauv, Petit Verdot, some Malbec, but they are the Bordeaux style red blends are the most notable. Octagon, RDV, which is I wish we had time we could spend an hour talking about RDV and Linden, Linden Hard Scrabble Red, RDV's Lost Mountain, and RDV's Rendezvous, King Family Vineyards Meritage. So the most notable wines are the red blends. That for obvious reasons, it gives winemakers a chance to, really craft an exceptional expression of their vineyards. Some of my favorite wines, though, are single varietal vineyard designates. A lot of like Cabernet Franc is something that I really love, and there at King Family and from Joy Ting Wine, the Cab Francs are some of my favorites. But yeah, the most notable wines are the red Bordeaux style blends, and those are the ones, by the way, that tend to across the competitions that I'm involved in. Those red Bordeaux style blends do tend to score higher, if that says anything. So let's, Wink, real quick, talk about hybrid grapes or multi-species grapes. I don't know if you have a preference. I would always call them multi-species and native grapes. So Vidal Blanc, if I'm going to talk, I think given the impacts of climate change here in Virginia, we've not necessarily seen an uptick of